Welcome back to another episode. And I am so excited. I have my good friend and New York attorney, Evan Schein, back on our podcast today. So, Evan, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely, Ron. It's great to see you. Great to be back with you and your audience.
So, I know that one of the things that we're going to be talking about today is prenups. But before we do that, I always ask the question, what is it that you and or your firm, right, are doing to disrupt the divorce? And if this is the first episode you're listening to, disrupting means, hey, listen, how are we looking at doing things better, more efficiently, not necessarily just making people upset with us, right? We're not trying to make it more difficult. So what are you or your firm trying to do or doing as it relates to disrupting divorce?
Ron, I got to tell you, I've told you before, I absolutely love this question. And I'm going to tie the question into the topic of the day, which is prenup. So I think in the disruption space, I think normalizing the conversation around prenups, right? Taking the stigma away from the word prenup. Look, prenup is not a romantic word. It's not a romantic conversation, but I would tell you it is one of the most important conversations that you can possibly have with the person you're going to marry. I think having that conversation, being transparent, talking about life and expectations, and the reality that, look, marriage is not the honeymoon, right? The honeymoon period is going to last, for however long it lasts, and then real life sets in. So I would say, in terms of disrupting the space, normalizing the conversation around prenups and making it something that everyone can feel comfortable in discussing and having that conversation.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And I think it is, we've seen prenups, right, over the last bunch of years get more attention from social media, from the news media in general. And I think this is a great conversation for us to have. So let's go ahead and talk about defining it. Like, what is a prenup? Let's start with the basics.
Yeah, at a very basic level, look, prenup is an agreement that people enter into prior to marriage. In New York, where I'm licensed and where I practice, it can cover many things. It can cover all financial terms, except in New York, you cannot put anything in there related to child support or the payments of children's expenses. It's against public policy. Child support and the payment of kid expenses would not be enforceable. And likewise, you cannot include anything about custody or parenting in a prenuptial agreement if you want those sections and paragraphs to be enforceable. But a prenuptial agreement is an agreement that people enter before marriage, and it resolves many of the issues that people fight about and argue about and spend tens of thousands of dollars fighting about when they're in a period of high conflict. So to me, if you can get an agreement done and have those conversations about what would happen in the unfortunate circumstance where we separated, and you're negotiating this in a period where you love one another and you're getting married, it's always much better.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go ahead and unpack this a little bit. So, in the prenuptial agreement process, when people are preparing for it, what types of financial disclosures are they supposed to be bringing to the table?
Rhonda, if I had a dollar for every time I was asked this question, I could probably retire. But the answer is important because if you're representing the person who is looking for the prenup, it's to that person's benefit to be overly inclusive, right? And I'm going to put an asterisk next to that because there is a sensitivity and there is an emotional component to sharing someone's true wealth, right? To sharing the assets that someone has. And so for many people, they're not comfortable disclosing everything that they have. So it's a balance between the more you disclose, the better it is. It will strengthen the validity of an agreement. And look, you're working hard, you're paying money to get an agreement done. You want it to stand the test of time. So I always say to someone, look, it's for your benefit. Disclose as much as you possibly can with as much detail. If the net worth is so astronomical, then, we can have the conversation about putting a range or a greater than number, but it is to that person's benefit to disclose, as many assets and as much detail as possible. And it goes for both sides. Both sides to a prenup must disclose their assets, bank accounts, investment accounts, any premarital separate property, businesses that either one of them have, right? The more you disclose, the better it is. And it's a crucial part of any prenuptial agreement.
And when people are considering having them written, again, they're bringing the assets in. One of the biggest challenges that I see is at the end of the day, it's okay, well, we've disclosed these assets, but it's very overarching. Like everything that was contributed within that account, growth within that account, like it's just seems so overarching that it seems very difficult and gets a little bit muddy when it comes time to potentially enforce it down the road, which is where, I typically see them, right? Not usually on the front end, I'm seeing them on the back end, and that becomes a real challenge. I'm working with a client right now. And again, one of the things they have to do is first determine the validity of the prenup. And until we can determine that, like everything else is kind of on pause because I went through it. I'm like, okay, here's all the things they have now. There's a whole handful of things that they didn't have then. So is it assumed that those are, marital versus it just becomes an absolute nightmare. So how do we deal with that?
Well, I think the answer is how do you prevent an absolute nightmare? I think the answer is to have a very strong and well drafted prenup. There are so many prenuptial agreements that are drafted improperly. They're missing certain things, certain language and certain provisions contradict one another. Essentially, the foundation of any prenuptial agreement, to walk through it for a moment, is the definition of separate property and the definition of marital property. How you define what's separate, how you define what's marital, and the overall asset that you might define as separate. Let's say you're looking to protect someone's business and you're protecting that as someone's separate property. How is income treated, right? That business throws off income. Is the income that's going to support the family lifestyle, is that income going to be marital, even though the business is protected as someone's separate property, right? So it's very important to define what's separate, what's marital, and make sure there's no contradictory statements throughout the agreement. A prenuptial agreement can also cover alimony, the payment of spousal support from one spouse to the other to maintain lifestyle. We can address those numbers in a prenuptial agreement, or you can leave it open. Many people often waive spousal support in the prenuptial agreement. Equitable distribution in New York or in other states, it's the division of assets and liabilities. Some people opt to resolve everything in their prenuptial agreement, really meaning all financial terms except for child support. And some people prefer a very limited prenuptial agreement if their goal is to protect, let's say, family wealth, family assets, real property, or specifically a business.
I know it's always hard to predict, right, what the future is going to look like. But let's say that somebody has signed a prenuptial agreement. It's coming time for divorce. And when we actually look at what they're claiming, it leaves one party with literally no assets, right? What do we do in a situation like that?
Well, the hardest thing is at the time you're married, life looks one way, right? And if you had a crystal ball and you tried to visualize what is life going to look like 10 years down the road, or even further, 20 years, 30 years, and you get married in your 20s or 30s, life in your 30s is going to look very different than life in your 60s. And people make sacrifices during their marriage. People have certain roles and responsibilities. And unfortunately, people will sign agreements that they sign because they're getting married. They feel like there is no alternative. And by the way, in New York, none of those rationales are defenses to signing an agreement, right? So you fast forward those 15, 20 years, people separate, people get divorced, and then there's a real question, is that prenuptial agreement enforceable? So you always start with the presumption it is, right? If the agreement is signed, if it's notarized, then you have an actual contract, right? Then you start going through it. Did both sides have independent counsel? Was there full financial disclosure? Are the terms fair at the time the agreement was signed? And are they also fair now? Is the agreement unconscionable? Was it the product of fraud or duress? You start going through those points and you see if there is anything that raises a serious concern. And on top of that, you look at the person's financial circumstances at the time they're separating and you see what position they would be in. Would they be a public charge? Is there such a gigantic disparity between one person's net worth and the other person's net worth at the time of separation and divorce? And again, part of it is rectified, at least in New York, because you can't address child support. And it also, in the prenuptial agreement, depends on what was the prenup intended to cover. So if the prenup was intended to cover everything, then the court in New York would be relatively limited on how they can compensate someone for, let's say, an inequitable prenup. If the prenup only covers someone's business, there's more of an opportunity for the court to say, okay, it's relatively common for someone to waive an interest in the other party's business, but so many other financial issues were not addressed. So now the court has an opportunity to address it.
Yeah, I love that because I think at the end of the day, like there is this pressure in the beginning. And so for me, what I see when the prenups come into play is, hey, I've helped my clients get through divorce. Despite them saying they would never be in another relationship, they're now facing an opportunity to, get married again. And they're having the conversation about prenups. And I think at the end of the day, I think a lot of times women's attitudes are, hey, I'll deal with it later. I'm feeling pressure. I want to get married. I was presented with this information a short time before the marriage ceremony, and I'm just going to sign it and I'll deal with it later. And that's a problem, right? So I think for me, the prenups aren't coming into, we're seeing them now, but I'm really seeing like, hey, how do we best position the clients that I've been able to serve as they're approaching this for the second marriage? And there are assets, right? And my initial understanding of prenuptial agreements and the way that I think of them is, hey, you want to be able to protect what you bring into the marriage so that you could take that back out. Not now you articulated those things and it includes every single thing from that point forward, So I just want people as they're thinking about this to really be empowered. I don't want to see women feeling like they are pressured to sign this anymore. Like I'm just
100%
I'm
agree. And I'll tell you, it's such a brilliant point you make because there's an emotional consequence to that. And what I've seen is if someone is pressured or feels pressured that they have no option and no alternative, the concern is you're entering the marriage and there is that resentment. There is that animosity that you feel, right? And you might not realize it early on because everyone's in that honeymoon phase and it's all, smiles and laughter. But at some point, you're going to think back to the prenuptial agreement conversation or really the lack of conversation that took place. I tell everybody, you want to be educated, you want to be informed, you want to be knowledgeable, and then make certain choices, right? Don't just accept an agreement without understanding it, without knowing the practical implication on what this means, what this looks like for your life, for potentially the family that you're building. And again, as attorneys, I live in a worst case scenario world. So I always think with my clients, what are the risks? What are the concerns? What is this going to look like 15 years from now if there's a separation and a divorce? And you can have those conversations with your client. And ultimately, whatever the client decides, at least let them make that decision with knowledge, right? There's a old expression, knowledge is power, right? So to me, make an informed decision. You need that understanding of the agreement, the purpose of it, the implications, and the position that you might be left in for better or for worse if you go ahead and sign this agreement. Now, there's also an opportunity during the course of the marriage to amend the prenuptial agreement or to do a postnup, which is really an agreement similar to a prenup. There's different legal standards, but a postnuptial agreement is a similar type of agreement that people enter into during the marriage, either to amend a prenuptial agreement or if they did not have enough time to finalize the prenuptial agreement. So I would say to everybody listening, there are options, right? The one thing you do not want to do is to rush into signing something without speaking to an attorney, without getting good advice, and without understanding your options so you can make an informed decision prior to signing or considering signing any agreement that's put in front of you.
This is why I love doing these interviews. You answered my question before I even asked it.
We're often sharing a brain. Look, the truth is, I know how you feel about this topic. You know how I feel about this topic.
Yeah.
And we're so passionate about it because we see the mistakes that, right? You see the mistakes that happen and you think to yourself, you know what? What could have I done differently if I had worked with that person, right? I know you think that, I think
Yep.
that. And I think just having the knowledge is so crucial. So you don't find yourself in a position where you're making a mistake on something so important.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think people forget that they can be amended, right? Like, again, you put them in place and it's like, "Oh, yeah, we set it and forget it, it's 10, 20 years ago, and now you're dusting it off, trying to figure out what the intention was at that time." Whereas I feel like if people could revisit that, whether it's every 3 to 5 years, and just kinda again, do we need to amend anything? Does everything still look good? I think, again, we started our conversation with you saying, "Hey, listen, it's really important for us to be able to have the conversation." But it isn't a once and done, right? Like, again, having that regular conversation throughout their marriage around the prenuptial agreement, because I do feel like a lot of times from what I'm seeing, it's an overarching aspect of control. And the parties don't necessarily remember what was in there, or they're feeling like it now gives them the opportunity to just do whatever they want whenever they want to do it. And that's a problem.
And not only is it a problem and you're spot on, life changes, right? You might be again in one financial position in your 20s when you're getting married, and then 10 years later, You might start a business. Your net worth might go from $1 million to $10 million or something like that. Life is going to change. Your financial situation is going to change. You might building a family, you might prioritize a family and then start a career, right? And you might open up your own business, open up your own practice, right? Everything changes. And to have an agreement that is fixed without there at least being a discussion or a conversation again in the future, to me, is something that needs to change. You should be able to have a conversation with your partner, with your spouse, with your significant other about money, about life, about expectations, about career, about businesses. Have those hard conversations. The other thing I would say, it's all the more reason, start the prenup process early on. Have those conversations not 2 weeks before you're getting married. Don't put yourself in that position. If you know you're going to want a prenuptial agreement, have the conversation early. Have the conversation before you start planning the wedding. And if you're on the receiving end of knowing that you're going to be asked to consider and sign a prenuptial agreement, bring it up to your partner, bring it up to your future spouse. Be like, hey, I know this is important to you. You mentioned it a year or so ago. Have that conversation. You're doing yourself a disservice by not bringing it up because you're going to want to be in a position where you can think clearly, you can think rationally, you can make informed decisions. And that's not going to happen a week prior to your wedding.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gives you time, right, to find independent counsel
Yeah.
to be able to review it and make sure that everything's been disclosed and everything is buttoned up like it should be. Gosh, we've covered so much ground in a really short period of time. But as we wrap up our time together, Evan, any final comments or thoughts around this topic?
Yeah, look, I think we've covered a lot. I could talk about prenups as I know you can for an hour, 2 hours. I think start early. I said it before and I'll say it again. I think have the conversation early. And even if an agreement is not going to be signed, I think having hard conversations, and I think it's true in all aspects of life, I think having those conversations, talking about life, talking about money, talking about expectations, right? What do we want our family to look like? Where are we going to live, right? What could we afford? I think having those conversations early on, it's so important, and it's not easy. And I realize that. And it's not a romantic or a sexy conversation. But guess what? Marriage isn't all of those things either all the time. I think marriage is hard work. And I think in order to have a successful marriage that stands the test of time, I think you need to have conversations. And if you find yourself in a conversation before you get married, when you're in that honeymoon stage, that's an eye opening conversation that you're like, whoa, maybe I take a step back here and reevaluate certain things. I can promise you it's better to have that conversation and think about that prior to getting married than 10 years into the marriage and with 3 kids later. So take your time, have the hard conversations. And if you're not comfortable having them alone, bring in a professional. I love the team concept. Bring in, a financial professional, bring in a couples therapist, if you want someone there to assist you and to assist and facilitate that conversation. But don't be afraid to have it. It's an important conversation and you'll be thankful later that you had it.
Awesome. Well, Evan, thank you so much for your time today. We are going to include all of your contact information in the show notes. And so
All
thank you
right.
for your time today.
No, I love being on with you and your audience, and you do such a fantastic job, Rhonda, at all, everything that you do. And it's great seeing you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.